Welcome. Suppose a study of slow speed accidents produced the following data. And so here is the non-existent data made up for example purposes. So driver was using a phone, driver was not using a cell phone while driving, and that driver was in a slow speed accident in the past year, and driver was not in a slow speed accident during the past year. So let's look at part A. Actually, we're going to look at all the parts and find the probabilities for each, but let's start with part A. Part A, event A is driver uses cell phone while driving. Well, here we have driver uses cell phone while driving. That is this entire row. And of this entire row, there are a total of 360 drivers that used a cell phone while driving. And this is out of a total, this is our grand total of 1,003 drivers. On your calculator, you can work this out to get 0.3589. So the proportion or the probability of a driver using a cell phone while driving is 0.3589. Okay, part B. What is the probability of this event, event B? The driver was not in a slow speed accident during the past year. Well, drivers not in slow speed accidents are here. And there was a total of 795 drivers not in a slow speed accident during this past year. So our probability, that is the probability of B, is equal to 795 divided by, again, the grand total of 1,003. And this works out to be 0.7926. Let's take a look at parts A and, let's take a look at part C. Part C, I want the probability of A and B. And if you notice, we still have our highlighting for part B. So that is all the drivers that were not in an accident at slow speed in the past year. Let's go ahead and put the highlighting back for drivers that used a cell phone while driving. So how many drivers used a cell phone and were not in a slow speed accident this past year? Well, that's in this box here. 282 drivers out of 1,003 were using a cell phone while driving and were not in an accident at slow speed. So the probability of A and B is equal to 282 divided by 1,003. Next, let's look at the probability of A or B, and here in part D, that is the probability that a driver uses a cell phone or a driver was not in a slow speed accident during this last year. So if you recall, to get this probability, we need to add up the probability of A plus the probability of B, and then we subtract something. We subtract the probability of A and B, and we already figured that out. That's this right here. Oh, and actually, I never put it as a decimal here, so let me quickly do that since we're going to use this right now anyways. As a decimal, this one here is 0.2812. Okay, so now that that is in there, let's go ahead and add up these two probabilities and subtract this one. Now, if you are stuck on why we're subtracting, well, remember, when we add up the probability of A, that's this entire row here. That includes this 282. When we add up the probability of B, that's this entire column here, which again includes the 282, so we've counted it twice. So remember, the probability of A that a driver is using their phone, we did 360 over 1,003. And then to that, we're going to add the probability that a driver was not in a slow speed accident this past year. That's 795 out of 1,003, which we've already done. And then we're going to subtract. And again, notice that when we added up 360, we added up 78 plus 282. When we add this 795 here, we're adding 282 a second time and a 513, which is why we're going to subtract it one more time. We're going to subtract 282 divided by 1,003. And what that is going to work out to be is 873 divided by 1,003. And this is the probability of A or B. And remember, this symbol here is equivalent to or. So before I get you the decimal approximation, let's think of a more intuitive way to do this. So if we're looking at or, we really want everything inside of this outline here. So we really could have done the probability. Actually, I need a little more space, so bear with me. We could have also done the probability of A or B is equal to 78 plus 282 plus 513 all over 1003. And what that's going to give us is 873 over 1003. So either way, the probability is the same. And what we end up with as a decimal is 0.8704. Let's continue. So part E, the probability of A given B. Let's recall A is a driver uses their cell phone while driving, and event B is driver was not in a slow speed accident in the past year. So suppose we select someone who was not in a slow speed accident this past year. What's the probability that they use a cell phone while driving? This can be worked out by computing the intersection of these events, or the probability of the intersection, that's probability of A and B, and dividing that by the probability of B. So the probability of A and B, we already know that that is 282 out of 1003. And from that, we're going to divide the probability of B, and B here is 795, and again, it's out of 1003. This is going to work out to be 282 divided by 795. Now, this is a very formulaic approach, but if you look at the highlights here, notice that for both of these, we have this denominator of 1003, and the way a fraction arithmetic works out, these go away. They cancel out. So really what you could have done is only select drivers from this column, since we're interested in selecting a driver who was not in a slow speed accident last year. We're interested in this group only. And how many out of this group used a cell phone? Well, that's 282. And the colors really help you see how this intuitive approach is a lot quicker and easier to understand than going ahead and using the formula. So if you can remember the intuitive approach, that's great. If not, you can use the formula. Either way, this probability works out to be 0.3547. Okay, so now it's time to look at parts F and G, but before we do that, I want everyone to get an eraser or whiteout and mark out this A on both of these. And you're going to replace that with the letter B here. And to emphasize that we fixed this, I'm doing this in red. You don't need to do it in red on your own paper, but you do need to change it to a B. So now C is the event. A driver was not using a cell phone. So that's this row here. And let's go ahead and erase these just to avoid any additional markings we don't need. So we want the probability of C, that is, a driver was not using a cell phone. And once we've selected a driver's not using a cell phone, what is the probability that they were not in a slow speed accident? And for this one, for this conditional probability, we're going to use the intuitive approach rather than the formulaic approach we used here. So first, let's look at the probability of C. So first, the probability of C. Well, let's take a look at drivers not using a cell phone. That's here. So of drivers not using a cell phone, there were a total of 643 out of 1003. This works out to be 0.6411. And next, let's look at the probability of B given C. So that is if we're looking only at drivers that did not use a cell phone. So we're only going to consider this row. And there are a total of 643 drivers in that row. It's this value here. So out of these 643 drivers, how many were not in a slow speed accident in the past year? Well, that's here. That's 513. And that works out to be 0.7978. Okay, so finally, part G. So we want the probability of B complement given C. So in this case, B complement, if B's driver was not in a slow speed accident in the past year, then B complement his driver was in a slow speed accident. So this here is B complement. Driver was in a slow speed accident. We can also denote it as B with a bar over it. Okay, so the probability that a driver was in a slow speed accident in this past year, given that they do not use a cell phone while driving. So again, we're only going to look at drivers that do not use a cell phone while driving because that event has already occurred. We're selecting out of these drivers. So we know they don't use a cell phone, and we want to know of these drivers how many were in a slow speed accident. So of course, there are still only 643 drivers that did not or do not use their cell phone while driving, and out of those, 130 were in a slow speed accident during the past year. This works out to be 0.2022. I hope you found this video helpful.